Okay, all right. So I'll do an explanation, I guess.
Yeah. Hello.
Man, such pressure. So what do we have, like a minute? Do you have the time?
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome back. If you notice, this is track 3 in the track 2 room. We're working on getting all of that sorted out, so bear with us while that happens. So this is a chess timer talk. So just for how many of you have attended one of these before? So some Korean returners. That's wonderful. Thank you for coming. All right, so the way it works is that we have 20 minutes allocated for questions from the audience, 20 minutes allocated for the speaker. We have a student volunteer, so raise your hand. She will run a mic to you for the questions. And if you remember, the first 5 minutes are given to the speaker, so you have to wait 5 minutes before you're able to ask your first question. So if you keep your hand up, 4:59, will be right there. So, okay? And so, take us away.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Or should I adjust this? Is this better? Better? Hello? Can everybody hear me, especially in the back? No? Can anyone help me with the microphone for a moment? I'm not sure how what's wrong here. Is this any better? No?
I think you have to talk into it when you bend down.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Maybe I should reposition this then. Is this better? Closer? Hello? Yeah? Okay. I hope I don't have to keep my head like this the whole time. And in any case, I'm available for discussion at any point, so if this fades off for you guys, I'm happy to talk about these things further. My name is Jesse Alama. I'm coming from Vicampo. Vicampo is an e-commerce shop based in Germany and also active in other parts of Europe as well. And my talk today is an exercise in trying to get you to be a little bit more imaginative. So I will talk about a couple of particular tools, a couple of particular techniques, a particular language that I'm quite fond of. But at the end of the day, the title of my talk is an invitation for us to think about compilers and languages. The idea is, I'm trying to get you to think that inside each of you, there's a little compiler engineer and it wants to come out. And that's the idea. A slogan for what I'm up to, if there's one short way of putting this, is that you may already be writing an evaluator or perhaps a compiler for a language. The language just doesn't exist yet. And it's your task to bring it into the world. That's the idea. By the way, just to clear the stage here, when I talk about languages, I just usually mean domain-specific languages, DSLs. So I'm not necessarily talking about making full-on programming languages. When I talk about this subject, there could be a bit of confusion right away, so let me clear that up. I'm not proposing that you do a solo cowboy thing and you invent your own full Turing-complete programming language just because you think that that's an awesome idea. I'm working in an industry setting, so I have a boss who has generously joined me today. And so the idea is, when we talk about making languages, this is often, at least for me and for many of you in this room, I hope, as a kind of Korean industry academia bridge thing here. I'm not necessarily talking about building your own cool full stack thing here. I'm talking about a domain-specific language. But why make them? Well, the idea is, I like to think of pain. For me, languages are driven by pain. That sounds strange, but the idea is that a language, for me, or what I propose to you, is that a language should be designed to help alleviate some kind of pain. I mean, why do we have the languages that we have? Presumably because there was some flaw or limitation in what was currently on the table, right? That means that we have a wide variety of languages out there today. And presumably there were some pains or set of pains that each of these solved. Yeah? They made things easier, they made things faster, they made things more convenient, it was more natural to express yourself. Whatever that is, there was some kind of pain that was being alleviated by this language. That's the idea. that I propose. Now, again, I'm working in a business setting, so I'm not just a solo guy here doing my own cool thing. I need to motivate what I'm doing, and it's in this setting I would propose to you that the pain that you're talking about, or the pain that you feel, is perhaps it's good if you could find somebody else who also feels that pain. Yeah, that way it's easier to motivate these things, to get other people on board with you. And if you want to talk about dollars and cents, euros and cents, pain that has a clear business case is also worth pointing out. What that means is I'm asking you to be a little bit practical here. So maybe some languages that you have in mind, maybe there's no really good argument for them. I mean, they're cool, they're fun, we all like to implement these things, but things that have a very clear business case are probably more likely to get accepted by your team and by the people who ultimately pay you. So what are the kinds of pains, the language pains that I'm talking about here? I think you've seen a couple of these. Too much boilerplate. There's just too much repetition. There's a repeated structure to all sorts of parts of your programs. For me, anyway, that's a kind of pain. It's kind of embarrassment. I don't like that very much. Excessive verbosity and repetition. How many of you have ever solved problems by copy and paste? I've done that, yes. We've all done that, I'm sure. But one has to ask oneself, is that really a viable long-term strategy for solving serious problems? Maybe, but probably not. But I would say that's a kind of pain. That's something you feel. You know that that's not quite right. Maybe it gets the job done, but in the long term, you might end up feeling even more pain later on. How many of you have ever felt that the language that you're currently using that's in front of you requires you to do shoehorning of foreign concepts? So what you're doing is you're trying to do, say, some kind of distributed computing thing in PHP or something like that. Something where you think this maybe it fits. I could get this to work, but somehow I'm trying to put a square peg into a round hole, or anything else. Awkward shoehorning. I felt that pain. I bet a number of you have felt that pain too. I'm hoping you do. How many of you have felt libraries just aren't cutting it? You can give me all the libraries in the world and they're just not going to solve my problem because there's just too much boilerplate here. I need to work at a different level. Have you ever felt that pain? Where libraries just aren't cutting it? This is the kind of pain that I have experienced and which motivated me, and I hope would motivate you as well. Again, think about the business here. So making a language takes time. It takes a certain amount of skill. How can you motivate this? How can you motivate that kind of thing to an employer, for instance? Well, the name of the game in business is saving time, reducing costs, especially the cost of error. For instance, if the language that you're working in turns out to be a very poor match for the kinds of very careful tests that you want to do, that's something worth considering there. One of the things that I found is that having a common language or making a new language might reduce some friction between people. I mean, so there is some value in having some kind of common core language, obviously, that's clear. But if we can talk about a problem in a domain-specific way, then in my experience, this can help reduce friction between different people and increase the clarity of communication. And ultimately, from a business point of view, I think this adds a lot of value, because if there's confusion between team members about what is to be done, then your application, your program, maybe isn't doing the right thing, and that's going to show itself later on. And one hope is that this can lead to profit for a business. This is the business case for making languages. I should have put one of these big stars here and a kind of disclaimer. Spoken in a fast way, I cannot guarantee that you'll necessarily make very large amounts of money by making domain-specific languages. Yeah, but this is something to keep in mind if you're working in a commercial setting, and you need to, or you feel that the need to develop a domain-specific language. The idea is try to think backwards. Try to put yourself in your employer's shoes and think what would be a good reason, a good justification for what you're about to do. Because at the end of the day, usually making domain-specific languages is not a very lightweight task. That's certainly a little bit heavier than making a function, yeah. Or if you're in a language with macros, it's probably a little bit heavier than making a macro. So you need to give some kind of justification for this. The language that I wanted to bring to your attention, I can't really go into too much detail about this. The language that I have used successfully for making domain-specific languages is called Racket. There are other languages out there that can do these kinds of things. In my view, Racket is perhaps a best of breed for these kinds of things. It's a Lisp. It's in the large family of Lisp languages out there. But and its origins lie in education, computer science education, even mathematics education, and programming language research. And it continues to play a role today. But more specifically for us, it also strives to be a best-of-breed environment or tool or language for what's so-called language-oriented programming. The idea that if we want to solve problems, why not, in some cases, try to adapt ourselves to the domain we're working in. I mean, Racket is a full-blown language all by itself, and you can just write Racket all day long. That's perfectly fine. But the idea is Racket wants you to take things one step further and try to develop some kind of domain-specific language. And Racket has many tools and techniques to help you with that kind of task. So what does plain Racket look like? If you've seen Lisp, this probably looks somewhat familiar. It doesn't matter. I mean, so these evil parentheses and braces and brackets are all over the place. Many people find this unreadable. I think it's beautiful. If you end up... I know, I'm weird. But here's the thing. I'll show you a piece of Racket that actually looks nothing like this. There's a custom tool that I have made in my commercial setting, which was designed to address a pain, a need, even a business need that I saw as a developer at Vicampo. Racket was the tool with which I implemented this. I call it Riposte. The idea is the motivation was I'm working in a web setting, HTTP setting. I had a number of tasks and problems maintaining a JSON-based HTTP API. And in the face of changing requirements and somewhat uneven quality of tests, I found that I needed to be more serious about writing integration tests for this service that we had. The problem that I found that motivated me, pain, was tedious and hard to read scripting tests. I really had no good way of doing this using the tools at my disposal. I could do it, but it was very painful. From a business point of view, there was a lack of tests, and so I needed to have some kind of integration tests or black box testing for the API. With a new feature, this led to an explosion of complexity for us as developers, because it turns out that there are now parallel versions of an API, and as you might imagine, the tests for a new feature now are multiplied, because one has to make sure that there are no regressions in the previous version of the thing, while the new version, which has endpoints that overlap with the previous version, has the new behavior. So there's an explosion of complexity here. And I needed to be more serious about my testing. The requirement, yeah, sorry.
So I've got a quick question, because you're talking about the motivations in a very kind of engineering way, right?
Yeah.
And in terms of what I suppose your boss would like to hear. But earlier when you were looking at the Racket, you used words like beautiful, right? So it seems to me that in practice, we as engineers don't just do things because of their technical merits, even if we like to imagine that we do. So could you speak just a little bit about, I guess, whether using this DSL approach or kind of developing repository, was that also really satisfying for you as a professional? Was it actually really engaging and a kind of a joyful experience as well as just, as well as reducing the pain to your employer?
Absolutely. I mean, I mean, this is. You're absolutely right. I think there are these aesthetic senses or a kind of joy that we want to experience with our work and with the products of our work. That was definitely motivating me. I'm quite proud of the tool, and I had a lot of fun building it. And that's what, at least in the case of Racket, I found, because there is so much invested in the language to help making DSLs easier, it was actually straightforward, and it turned out to be a real joy for me. I mean, I can talk about this stuff all day long, but I feel that perhaps it's a bit of a taboo subject, maybe it shouldn't be, to talk about the kind of joy that we experience of the beauty of the language. Yeah. Thank you for your question, it's very nice. What was the requirement for me in this tool? So I had some pain. Yeah.
I have one more question, if you don't mind. Hi,
No,
Leandro
not at
from
all.
Spotify here.
Yeah.
Were you working by yourself on Riposte at Vicampo, or did you have to work with other people in developing this tool as well?
At the beginning, I was working by myself, yes. The problem, I mean, I had a task, namely testing an API, but my coworkers also had the same task. So, of course, in that sense, we had the same goals. But the development, at least for now, was just by myself. So in that sense, it was a siloed project. And there was some luxury that comes from having a siloed project. Is that what you have in mind?
Not in mind, but I hope everyone hears. I guess my question was, you begin developing this, that clearly is something that you enjoy building and that will help you achieve your task. But in the setting of a business, you probably want to be able to pass that on to whatever other engineers so they can continue building on it as well.
Yeah.
Now, if you leave the campus, something happens to you, then what's going to happen with the development of the repository? Might be a good thing to build it because you save time on doing the testing, but you're also introducing a really big risk for the company. Yeah,
that's absolutely right. I think that should be clear. I mean, if we want to talk about the business cases for domain-specific languages, that is 100% a valid point. There is an element of risk that gets added when one does these kinds of projects. That's absolutely right. I mean, ultimately, it wouldn't hurt me that much to look at the current state of affairs and say, this is a kind of prototype tool, which at some point could be re-implemented in something else. That's actually fine. And I think that doesn't detract from the point of Racket and having these tools for developing prototypes, if you want to put it that way. That's fine.
Hi.
Or, yeah, please.
A counterpoint to my countryman's question about the joy of developing a new tool.
Yeah.
This is something that I think most engineers enjoy and programmers enjoy. And sometimes I feel that the benefits of building something new, we need a DSL for this.
Yeah.
Often they're overstated because the engineers are just sick of dealing with the existing interfaces.
Yeah.
And yes, the pain points can exist, but I feel that often the need for a new tool, a new language, a new DSL is often overstated by engineers who just want to do something different or use a new tool.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, how do we make sure that people on both sides of the fence, that the business people can understand the value of building something new rather than just banging your head against some legacy API that's unmaintainable. So we want them to have a balanced view, but we also want the engineers to have a balanced view about whether there actually is a business case or not to do some new thing.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think in the case of the tool that I have in mind here that I'm referring to, that was a relatively low-risk investment because the thing is not terribly complex, but when we talk about designing, say, new languages or new tools that design considerably more complex things that really would require considerably more input and manpower, then I think it's probably the right thing to say, to talk about this with your boss first, right? I mean, there's always the danger. I mean, probably all of us have a kind of own secret projects, the things that exist only on our laptop that help us only with our work. We don't necessarily intend to share with other people. And the question is, at what point do you want to say, to wave a flag, so to speak, and say, I think there's something here, we need to elevate the discussion, and because this goes beyond just what I think is cool and useful. I really think there's value here. And I don't think I have a good answer for that yet. I think that's something.
Can I chime in on that? So doesn't it depend on whether or not the DSL is being used by, how many people are going to use it in the end, right? If there are a whole bunch of people in the company who need to do a certain task, then certainly there's huge payoff if you do it well. Right? It's not just the one engineer who wanted to do something interesting for a little while so that they could make their life easier. They're making maybe 10 or 20 people's lives easier. Then certainly pay off.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there's always a kind of, for any really new idea, I think that's always the question. I mean, is this something that is just appealing for me, or am I trying to help others? I mean, the intention behind this tool was to help myself first, and then it escalated in my mind because I saw that other people in my team were suffering with exactly the same problems. I don't know. I don't know. That's very good. Any further questions? Yes, please.
Is this tool open source function?
Coming soon, yes.
Because a lot of people are trying to use Google on it.
Ah! That's fantastic. I didn't, yeah?
And it's unsuccessful.
Correct, yes. In fact, this may end up becoming some kind of open source thing at my company. I need to discuss the details with my boss. I would love to share this with the world. I think you guys would love this a lot, especially those who are working with HTTP APIs in JSON.
Real quick, is there any connection to your Argo projects that I see here on your website?
Yes, there is a connection to that. That was a kind of solo effort. That's just me as a kind of guy on the couch working on Saturdays. But you're referring to a JSON schema validator. Yes, right. Any further questions? I really appreciate the discussion.
Can we see what it looks like in your language?
Yes. I love that timing. The idea was, I've seen a number of text formats for writing some kind of HTTP testing things. So Riposte is inspired by a number of things that are currently out there. For instance, Emacs has got something like this. Yes, I'm one of those Emacs guys. There are a number of other tools. For instance, PHP Storm has got such a thing, or the other in general, this, what's the company that's behind PHP Storm? I'm sure that you can find this in other JetBrains tools too. The idea was to, okay, what are we doing what am I doing, what is our team doing when we're working with our API? Well, we're basically shipping some kind of JSON back and forth. At the end of the day, it's nothing more or less than that. But the idea is, I wanted to take JSON and have some way of programming JSON, if that's the right word for it, by giving some kind of names to things. So for instance, one of the very basic tasks that we do in the API that I'm talking about, or it's under discussion here, is logging in. Very simple, right? Not too difficult. Well, I wanted to have some kind of mechanism for keeping things compact and short and more or less kind of, let's call it, dumb or really explicit. Very simple. There are no loops here. There's no recursion. There's no branching. There's no if-then. It's just a simple scripting language where we say, go, let's do it. The idea is, well, we have some kind of base URL, or URI if you're one of those guys. And the idea is we have some kind of base URL, and we're constantly sending requests to this thing. Well, we want to log in. Well, log in, how do you do that? Well, at the moment, the structure is, well, that's just an email and password. So what we do is there's a kind of, we just directly write our kind of JSON payload here. The idea is, well, we can query things from the environment. Don't put passwords in plain text files that go under source control. But you can put this kind of thing in source control. You can put your email and password there. You can see this is language already in this part is a kind of extension, if that's the right word, of JSON, the basic JSON syntax, because you can refer to variables here. And already that is already a nice payoff with this language. As you might have guessed, I'm saying that the hash character is the comment character here. You can basically say things, okay, let's throw this thing to some URL, which ultimately gets expanded based on that. And we say, okay, this thing comes back with us with some kind of 200 class HTTP response. I actually don't care exactly what it is. It could be 200, it could be 204. It doesn't matter to me, at least not right here. And so we give some kind of pattern. This is just some kind of 2XX thing. Then what I also was struggling with was a way of keeping state between different requests, which is in fact what's going on when one cruises an API with, say, an iOS app or something like that. Well, we get our key, assuming that we've logged in. If you fail to log in, then this step is going to fail. If you get to this point, well, there's the key. The response is a JSON object. Let's take the key. So there's a kind of JSON pointer notation here. So what's going on is that in this language, I'm embedding a bunch of other languages. So it's a DSL that has little languages inside it, if you will. There's basic JSON here with a little bit of extension for variables. You can define new things here. There's also a URI template. This is not the best case of that because there's no real template going on here. Oops, sorry. Please come back. There's some kind of JSON pointer, which is a dead simple language for querying JSON arrays and objects. So that's what it looks like. I can give you some more examples. Yeah.
My question is, designing languages is notoriously hard, right? And if I want my inner compiler engineer out, how do I know if he or she, I guess, is any good, right? What were your criteria for evaluating your language design?
Do other people in my team solve their problems with it? So I like to solve my problems with it, but that's the siloed, solo cowboy programmer, which I'm not trying to be here. One test is, do other people really embrace this? Or do they think, that's just more typical Jesse weird stuff?
It's a
right?
choice.
Yeah, sure. That's right. I mean, you don't necessarily have to use this. Yeah, you can do all these tests in your own other way if you wish. But the idea is that this introduces a kind of, the goal is that this is a kind of common language, a new common language for these kinds of tasks, like this domain-specific task. Am I answering your question? I'm not sure if, yeah. Okay. Because there might have been a related question there, which was something like, how do I know if I'm any good at designing?
That was implied.
Yeah, right. Maybe the simple test is, do other people also want to use it? Do they enjoy it? Do they think that this is useful to them?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So may I ask, what is your technology stack at the company? What are you using?
Well, this is primarily, at the moment, a PHP-driven API. And then this is a tool for testing against that. It's a kind of integration test for it.
Yeah, maybe it's the beginning of the language, but to me it looks very similar to pure JavaScript. So, I mean, you can achieve the same thing with a bit of, syntactic annoyance, but is it that different to have a specific, DSL for that?
A DSL for what?
For defining this, this HTTP testing.
Do you mean?
You can just write the same thing with a bit of syntactic annoyance in JavaScript or in a Scala DSL, like if you look at Gatling, for example, it looks very similar.
Yeah, that's right. I think in recent years, I think there's been an explosion in this DSL space. So I don't mean to claim that Racket is the only thing here, or even the most suited thing for your use case. Again, I think I have two points that I want to make. I'm talking about Racket and this particular tool, but then I'm also kind of asking us to imagine inventing our own languages. And if that means you do something in JavaScript, if that means you do something with Scala, I consider that a win from my point of view.
I guess this is somewhat related. That's why I want to ask it now. I make quite a lot of DSLs for my personal use, but I always make them embedded DSLs, mostly in Haskell or even in like Lua or something like this, where I can meta-program a lot. So I've looked at Racket before, and I never understood like when would I actually use Racket to completely make like when do I need a whole parser and everything? Or when isn't it not enough with, well, like Lua, for example, I can meta-program beyond anything I've needed so far. So yeah, when would I actually really need Racket is my question.
Yeah, that's right. I think that argument is perhaps not so easy to answer instantly. I'm not sure if I can give you a knockdown argument for that. I mean, again, this goes back to the similar question. There is a considerable overlap of tools and whatnot here. Yeah?
Yeah, so this code here is interpreted in Racket, in a Racket interpreter?
This thing, if I may skip ahead to...
Because my question, and I'll just go ahead and state it quickly, is if this is interpreted in Racket, wouldn't hygienic macros be a better choice than a completely separate language like this one?
Yes, but in a PHP shop, perhaps not. It's simply for the, I mean, the problem is, I think I've learned by experience to be a little bit cautious in advocating things like Lisp. Because, yeah, it's true, you probably have to do, the S expression stuff at some point, that's clear. But that's not for everybody, and I get that. And the point of my language here is actually to respect that and to offer a way of saying something that's simple, basically just JSON, more or less, and you can just run with it. The fact that this is running in Racket, or the fact that this is in fact a Racket program, actually I can kind of keep that in my back pocket. I don't have to emphasize that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is it okay not to ask a question, but use case about this one? Why would I want to do a separate language instead of embedded language? Because I'm developing a DSL in Rust, but I want my DSL scripts to be editable by other people, and I don't want to ship a Rust compiler with those DSL scripts. So that's why I want to kind of compile my own compiler that is a lot simpler and doesn't have any dependencies like Rust compiler would do.
Right. I think this depends a little bit on the environment that you're working in. I think if you're working with the community of Rust programmers already, then I think they're already on board with what you're doing. Is that answering your question? I mean, I think, in other words, when I thought, am I going to really force or try to persuade my colleagues to do this all in Racket or use an S expression syntax?
That's the exact point. I
don't
want to sell Rust to my kids. I just want to sell this simple language.
Yeah, exactly. Then we
They don't know Rust.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly my issue as well.
I want to keep Rust as a part of our deployment.
Right. So you have some standalone binary that does the thing. Yeah. And that's in fact what's going on here too. Just to give you a little bit more sense of what's going on here and what kinds of needs came up. If we want to do things like, imagine we have some kind of checking, shopping cart, and we want to check, well, is the initial cart empty or mostly empty? Well, what we could do is we could say things like, well, let's take a UUID that comes to us from the environment somehow. The thing will just bail out if that environment variable is missing. Then we can say things, okay, let's just fire off a request. It responds with some 200 class response. I don't care if that's exactly what it is. we can extract the data from the response, and then there's, of course, the check. Is that really JSON? Is it valid JSON? And then we can make assertions about it. Something like, well, the shop is working in Germany, so the currency had better be euro. The total for a completely blank card had better be 0. And then I can actually now make assignments and checks in one fell swoop. Again, with this simple language, I can say something like, there had better be some ID there that's in the response payload, and that had better be a positive integer. If not, bail out. Things like, well, an empty shopping cart is kind of, well, what's the shipping total? 0, maybe non-zero, it doesn't matter. You can just basically write, so in this sense, with this language of assertions, it's again a kind of hybrid language of JSON pointer, a JSON itself, and my own kind of home-brewed equality testing, and so forth. Yeah.
With boring languages, you often have all kinds of additional support in the form of syntax highlighting or code completion. What is the story with?
To be developed. You're absolutely right. That's one of the things that, one of the dangers from, say, a team point of view when working with a new language. Where's the syntax hiding, right? There are some things that come with Racket that actually provide this information. There's a tool called Dr. Racket that actually supplies very useful syntax information. But I didn't want my teammates to learn about that tool. And so at the moment, it's just plain text. There's no syntax highlighting, which is a weakness, certainly.
Kind of on the same train.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can infer from what I see what are the semantics of the language, what's happening where and why, or how I'll be able to kind of compute it manually on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
Have you defined any of that at any point? Like when you build an interpreter, I reckon that you encode that somewhere, right?
Yes, there is the interpreter.
Now, how do you make that available for people actually working with the DSL so that they can reason through the scripts they're writing?
You're right. Well, I think I don't really, I try to avoid going down a kind of formalized semantics route here. It's a kind of, how to put it, learning by doing, a kind of unspecified or halfway specified semantics. I mean, the idea is something like, if you wish, you could say something like, well, there are classes of assignments which are changing an environment or some kind of table somewhere. There are these commands which mean that an HTTP will be built with that URL. There's a kind of semantics here for, say, URI template, which is what's being used here as well. The semantics here about comparisons are inherited from the semantics of JSON comparisons and what it means for two JSON values to be equal. That's certainly true.
Have you written any documentation internally for learning how to write this test, or is it mostly, okay, let's look at the ones that have been written before, and if so, how have you dealt with adding new features to the language, breaking backward compatible changes?
There is some documentation for this, but at the moment it's, the documentation, perhaps that's the wrong word, is simply, this is a task, and this is how you would achieve that using this language. So it's, from a, say, programming language point of view, it's quite unsatisfying, certainly. Admittedly, yes. Yeah. But that was part of the point. I mean, for the environment that I was working in, this turns out to be sufficient, or this is satisfactory. There's, by looking at some examples and saying, okay, that's how you can do it. That works. That's sufficient. Yeah.
Right in front of you?
Yeah.
So what I always end up running into with DSLs are, I'm somehow an edge case user, it seems, with every DSL I use. And so as a DSL designer, how do you make that decision to support edge cases? Do you just look at the data and say, this is what I'm going to support, and if you're outside of that, then you're SOL, then you aren't supported, or do you try to keep responding to edge cases in the data and add complexity?
if you might humor me and think about this kind of task, what might be some edge cases that could come up? Things like, for instance, the response that comes back to us is malformed or something like that, or is empty, or is too big to even load into memory. Is that the kinds of things that you're talking about?
Or I have like a shopping cart application that is now being used for like blockchain applications where my shopping cart is now some sort of weird
coin. Right. My first reaction to that use case would be something like, well, perhaps, would it be sufficient to change this to something else? I don't know. I mean, I think the idea is you have, with this tool, we have a more or less firm understanding, certainly within the team and in our documentation, for what it's supposed to do. And the scripting language doesn't try to go beyond that. So if things come up that that we don't expect, then I guess that will be reflected in the script. And yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the audience is out of time, and you have about a minute left. So, so you can either answer one more question, or you can wrap up. Or
I will wrap up. The last slide of my talk is, again, just take a step back. We've talked a little bit about Racket in particular, this tool in particular, but that's not necessarily the exact message that I'm aiming for. What a more general message is to get us to think about the pains that we experience when we're programming. I outlined some of them. And to ask yourself, next time, when you feel some of these pains, to try giving yourself a bit of breathing room and ask yourself, am I working on something? Am I writing a program for a language that may not exist? Is my language the best fit for this kind of program? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it isn't, but you go on anyway. That's also fine. But at least keep the question in your mind. Keep yourself open to that. And here's one question that I really like. I ask myself sometimes. If I had the freedom to write a part of my current program in a language of my choice, maybe even a language that doesn't exist yet, what would that look like? And what you saw earlier, what I'm showing you earlier, are the results of these thought experiments for myself. And just to wrap up, I'd like to quote a passage from a couple of my favorite philosophers of recent years, Junior and Senior from American Chopper. These guys design motorcycles, I make languages. That's pretty cool stuff. Senior says, it says here that language-oriented programming is a powerful problem-solving approach. Let's try it. With those kind of tattoos, I think he's in a good position to ask the question. And, well, our programmers need to work at the common language, not waste time building their own. Don't you see how much time we waste already by failing to adopt the right abstractions? This is a PHP shop, for God's sakes. Not everyone here is a friggin' compiler engineer. We need better libraries, not more languages. But soon enough, you'll find yourself reaching the limits of your expressivity. I'm going to learn more about Racket, and you can do whatever you want. Thank you for your time.
Let's give a big round of applause for a man who, first chess time we talk at the conference, an extremely diligent audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One quick announcement before you leave the room. We will be switching the tracks back after lunch, so they will be back matching your schedule. But so that means that the Adam Har Monad talk will be in this room. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.